So, hi everyone, welcome back to our podcast interview. And today, this is the second series of our video interview with Amanda, whom you might have listened to in the last episode. Amanda, I'll let you say one or two lines about yourself, about where you work and where you're calling from at the moment.
Sure. So I am an eating disorder clinician in St. Louis, Missouri. I work with McCallum Place Eating Disorder Centers. And I'm currently in California, in Palm Desert, California, for the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals Conference.
Wow. I'm so happy to be able to get this little slice of time from you because I know you're busy traveling at the moment. It's funny because I'm calling in from Canada and Amanda, you're right now in California, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful. And I think it's such a privilege for us to connect at this time. I'm so thankful for technology because something that's really been on my heart to create this particular episode is really for parents and loved ones who have sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, or loved ones who are struggling with an eating disorder. And so often, when they write emails to me or they reach out to me asking for help, very often I feel that their questions they're not easy. They're very challenging, actually. And so when I heard about your passion to help families, and I remember you were sharing with me about, your interest in like attachment theories and things like that, I thought it would be so wonderful to actually interview you and to hear some of your advice, your thoughts and tips for people who really want to reach out to those who are struggling in the darkness right now. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you don't, if you don't mind me asking, Amanda, like what led you to, discover this passion for helping people with eating disorders and also reaching out to their families? Because that's very tricky sometimes.
Yeah. So I think in some ways I kind of stumbled into the field of eating disorders and that
Right.
I was relocating to the St. Louis area and seeking employment. And I remembered coming across an eating disorder treatment center when I was looking for information on eating disorders and how to support my patients. And
Right.
when I was relocating, went back to that website to see if that particular facility was hiring. And they were. And so that's kind of how I got into eating disorder treatment.
Right.
And graduate school, I really had no prior experience or education on eating disorders. It wasn't really a topic that was even discussed. And so I had
Mm.
limited knowledge going into the field, but developed an interest and began working at this treatment facility. And so in some
Wow.
ways it was accidental, but also I've not personally escaped the impact of diet culture in our society and have
Mm.
had some of my own personal journey and experience with disordered eating and negative body image. So in
Mm.
some ways it was also serendipitous that this is something that I've also struggled with in some ways and now really feel passionate about empowering and helping others.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's so beautiful because I think your personal experience really adds, a very personal touch to your therapy and your interactions with patients, I'm sure. Yeah. I think one of the questions that, I've encountered a lot from parents especially is how can they get involved? Because I think when their loved one is struggling with an eating disorder, I almost feel like they're at the periphery, like almost as if they're standing outside a looking glass, looking in, watching somebody suffer, but not actually knowing how to approach that person, especially when you live with the person day in, day out, and you look at their eating habits or their exercise habits, and how do you even approach them, especially when the relationship is strained already?
Sure. I think just
Yeah.
acknowledging that you see that something is going on, even if it's not that you're expressing that you see what they're engaging in behaviorally,
Mhm.
but you see that they're in some sort of pain, or they're struggling with something internally, and that you want to be able to provide help and support. I think
Mhm.
verbalizing that and allowing the person to feel seen and supported in that way can be really powerful. And we're not always ready to accept support when it's offered, but sometimes just letting someone know that we see that they're suffering or pain, that they're enduring, that they don't have to go it alone, can plant a seed within that individual that help and support is there when they are ready to allow it.
That sounds like what we talked about in the previous episode, right? When you're just being there in love and in patience and showing them that you care.
Yes. And I think if the individual is working with a treatment team, like a therapist or dietitian or psychiatrist, or certainly in higher levels of care, there can often be opportunities for family therapy as well, either with the family of origin or family of choice, meaning spouse, children, friends,
Right.
and
Right.
others. So if the individual is willing to allow you to participate in their treatment process, I think
Right.
that is very powerful and will lend to the best outcomes, because we
Wow.
can't recover from eating disorders alone. We do need
Right.
the support of others.
Wow, that is really powerful. And I think when it comes from you, that like you are offering it, it becomes very, very powerful, because that person may not be brave enough or feel vulnerable enough to ask you, right?
Right.
Yeah. And throughout this process, how can loved ones continue to maintain a sense of hope? Because like sometimes when you see your loved one going through this, they go through cycles,
Yes.
and it can be a time of a lot of self-blame, like I caused this because she's my or he's my. How would you encourage parents or loved ones who are going through this cycle of negative self-talk, that maybe it's my fault and things like that?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of trying to cultivate a sense of hope when they see that their loved one continues to maybe make progress and then fall or return to familiar cycles, I think just acknowledging and understanding that that's a part of the process. And
Right.
we want individuals to be able to develop new skills to replace the eating disorder or maladaptive means of coping. And
Right.
sometimes they're going to be triggered and they're going to have setbacks, and that's a part of the process.
Wow.
Treatment and recovery is not linear, and so there are going to be ups and downs.
Right.
Um, and sometimes it seems as though we're taking several steps forward, something
Right.
happens, and then we take some steps back. So that's
Wow.
a part of the process. So I think understanding and embracing that and
Right.
anticipating that it's going to be a struggle and take time
Wow.
can lend to there being more hope. I think when
Wow.
we go in with the expectation that there's going to be a quick fix or this is something that can
Yeah.
be easily remedied,
Right.
that's when we start to feel really frustrated and hopeless. But if we
So true.
understand that it's a journey and it's going to take some time, I think that allows for more hope and acceptance.
That is so true. That is so true. And I think even as you were sharing, I remember that one thing that really brings me hope when I think about it is that, even in my own experience, although, I'm on the other end, I'm not the parent, but it made me realize that through this incident, through this circumstance, that I was able to develop a stronger relationship with my loved ones,
Mm-hmm.
because it gave such an opportunity for deeper understanding. And a lot of times, and I love to hear what you think as well, that eating disorders are somehow rooted or entrenched in certain kinds of, family dynamics or relational baggages.
Yes.
And the healing process can often be a wonderful, wonderful time for us to uncover some of the, like what you said, the maladaptive behaviors or thoughts, or some of the negative roots. And it's a wonderful time to kind of weed them out. And when we do, then it kind of provides like a beautiful, fertile soil for something beautiful to grow in future.
Yes. So I tend to view eating disorders, not always, but often, as attachment disorders. So I don't
Right,
want to make generalizations and say that every time someone has an eating disorder, it's rooted in attachment injuries, but
right,
often that's the case. And so even if an individual has a very supportive, loving home environment, sometimes there are things that we as parents do, and you and I are parents, so I think that we can say
mm,
this, but there are
yeah,
some things that we do inadvertently that negatively impact people that we care about. So, a very casual comment about our own body and relationship with food can
mm,
negatively impact a child's
right,
viewpoint or perspective on their own body image
right,
and
right,
relationship with food. Certainly, the messages that we receive from society can impact
right,
our belief around deservingness of eating certain foods or
right,
needing to appear a certain way in order to receive or be deserving of love and connection. And so I think that these are various forms of attachment injuries when we're
Right.
attached to a parent or primary caregiver or another member of society. And we want very much to be loved and accepted by those individuals. And there's some message that we receive in which we have to be a certain way in order for needs to be met. And that can be very traumatic on a very basic and on a very deep level, and
Wow.
sometimes lends to vulnerabilities to development of mental health
Right.
disorders.
Actually, that really brings up a question, which is, what is this attachment theory that you speak of, and how can we apply it to our lives? Because in a way, what I'm hearing from you is that you're saying that, eating disorders can develop because of maybe of a need of approval from, a parent or a higher authority. So how do we untangle this? Because a lot of times when eating disorders manifest, it's not when your child is 3 or 7, but when they're in their teens or when they're older. And a lot of the so-called I'm not sure if I should use the word damage, but some of the conversations that have taken place are already in the past. So how do we move forward to remedy this? And
Yes.
in the
So
same vein, like, how do we prevent this?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's important to understand how and why we interact with people that we're in relationship with. And so this is where attachment theory comes in. And
Right.
it essentially looks at, how do we engage with our primary caregivers and vice versa. So there
Right.
are different types of attachment styles that we develop with our parents from birth. So
Mm-hmm.
if we have parents who, as a basic example, if I fall and scrape my knee as a child, and I have a parent who, rushes to me and is very excited and anxious and fearful about this minor scrape I have on my leg, I thought I just fell and had a minor injury. But
Right.
their reaction and response is much more severe, and that invokes anxiety within me. So now
Right.
I am starting to feel anxious. And so
Okay.
there's this experience that happens with our caregivers in which we start to mirror their responses and start to make sense of how our needs are going to be met. So are we
Right.
going to be met with a parent who is very anxious, or are we going to be met with a parent who's very despondent and
Right.
neglectful, or someone who's very permissive, someone who's really inconsistent in how they show up for us? And that's
Right.
how we start to make sense of other relationships in the world, and we start to make generalizations about how capable people are of showing up for us and what we have to do in order to get our needs met. So, in that example of an anxious parent who's presenting to the child with a scraped knee, I
Right.
would start to learn that when something bad happens, my caregiver is going to be very anxious, and I might even learn that I need to minimize my stress response in order to reduce their stress. Or I may feel like I have to start to caretake them in order to reduce their stress response when something happens
Right.
to me. There can be codependency that develops in the
Right.
relationship. So it's important to understand the dynamics between a parent and child and
Wow.
how those interactions affect the way that we respond to one another and how we
Right.
make sense of other relationships in the world.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like this is very deep. What all the things that you're mentioning, it sounds like there are, so many different kinds of ways that we can interact with our parents. And I'm curious to know, is our eating disorders almost always entrenched in family or relational kind of challenges and issues?
I think often, yes. I don't think always. Again, I don't want to make generalizations because I
Right.
think certainly I've worked with patients
Right.
who have not been able to identify any sort of attachment injury.
Sure.
Even if it's not within the family of origin,
Hmm.
sometimes there's a child who presents to treatment and they have a really supportive and loving family.
Right.
We don't really see any attachment injuries or
Right.
inconsistent ways that the parent has shown up or parented
Right.
that child, but perhaps they were in a larger body and they were
Right.
bullied in school. And so in that setting, there was an attachment injury with peers, and that they learned that in order to be accepted, my body has to appear a certain way. And that can lend to the development of an eating disorder. Or maybe there's some other sort of, sexual or domestic violence or trauma that happens in relationship with someone outside of the family of origin. And they'll become attachment injury and lend to mental health disorders.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. I feel like, even as you are sharing, that one word that keeps coming to my mind is forgiveness. Because I think so often this subject becomes difficult to broach when parents or loved ones feel that they're partially responsible. Because then there's a lot of shame and anger and pointing fingers in a way, because the child might feel that it was your fault, or the parent might feel that, I've done my best. What more can you ask of me? And I'm just wondering, how has forgiveness played a part in therapy? Because I think people who are watching this or listening to this right now, they might be struggling and thinking to themselves, like, I caused this in some way, and yet I did my best. So what can I do now? And
Well, I would say that there are a lot of reasons why eating disorders develop, and no one can cause another person to develop an eating disorder. So it's not about placing blame, but trying to understand all the factors that contribute to the development of an eating disorder. And the attachment piece is one of those. There's also often a genetic component. Sometimes the child's or the individual's temperament can lend to eating disorder development. So it's really not about placing blame, but trying to understand all of the things that would have contributed to the eating disorder development. And then we want to be able to try to understand how we can remedy those. Certainly if it's biological or hereditary, that's not something that we can change. But if there's some dynamic that's playing out in the family that we can do some work around, that can be really powerful and impactful, because we can recover from those attachment injuries and we can change our attachment style, but we have to understand those patterns and how they developed and how to do things differently. So I think that's what we try to bring into family work with patients is, what are the things that are not working within the family system? And if they're not working for the child, in some way, they're probably not also working for that parent. And so how can we cultivate healing for the entire family unit, not just to heal the individual's eating disorder, but to provide healing in each of those relationships? So when parents ask about, well, what can I do, or what did I do, that you're missing the point. The point really isn't about finding people to blame, but it's looking at what are the things that have contributed and how can we prevent this from the eating disorder from taking further root, and how can we start to heal? And a lot of times families really want to know how to support. Well, if we understand the things that are not helpful in the family system and family dynamic, and peer relationships at school, wherever those injuries are occurring, if we can understand them and learn how to do things differently, then that can just foster a healing environment for that individual.
Wow. That is really powerful, Amanda, because what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be a balance. I think what you said when you mentioned that you can't take ownership for somebody else's challenge. That's too much. That's not our burden to bear. But then I'm also hearing you say that there is such a powerful place when the parent or the loved one takes a role in reflection, in terms of, thinking about what are some of the dynamics or the relational issues that might have been brought in, and then working together to kind of go through and heal as a family. Because the words that come to my mind are like, repentance and forgiveness, that healing can only take place when both sides actually come together and realize that this is a battle that we have to fight together. Because if we spend all the time pointing fingers at each other, then essentially no healing can take place.
Yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
So we have family days once a month at McCallum Place for
Wow.
patients and their family members. And there was a powerful experience in the last family day where
Right.
a parent had asked some questions of the patients there and said,
Right.
what are the things that your family members have done to contribute?
Mm-hmm.
And, what do you do if you find fault in how someone parented? And an adolescent said, I definitely believe that my eating disorder developed because of the fat shaming and fear of weight gain and
Right.
the culture within my household of being very appearance oriented. And she said,
Right.
and I don't blame my parents. They didn't know what they didn't know.
Wow.
And now they do. And so now they're working to change their language and their own
Wow.
relationship with their bodies and how they interact with
Wow.
their bodies and food so that I can come home to an environment that's safe. So she had
Wow.
no resentment toward her parents. She had forgiven them for things that had
Wow.
happened, and
Wow.
understood that they were doing the best that they could. And
Yes.
and now that they're empowered with this new information,
Wow.
now they have the opportunity to change and to create an environment that no longer fosters the eating disorder.
Wow. That is incredible. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. Because then there is empowerment on both sides, isn't there? Ownership on the parents to realize that this is the language I've been using and I need to change it. But I think it's so liberating and powerful when the child or the person no longer has a victim mindset. There's also so much compassion knowing that the parents didn't know what they didn't know. And it's true now that I've become a parent, I realize that I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect from the start. That's so hard to admit sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. And with that, actually, one of the questions that I have is what are some of the things that parents can do and can avoid to avoid an environment that cultivates this negative body image? Like, how can we create an environment that we don't want to like create false sterile bubbles for our children. We can't. But how do we create such a positive environment for our children such that um, they can such that we can say we did our best,
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think when it comes to eating disorders specifically and body image, I think we have to look at ourselves.
Right.
What are the beliefs that we have about our own bodies and about food? And what's the language that we use? Does my child see me body checking myself in the mirror? So looking in my mirror and maybe touching my body or analyzing it in different ways. And how does the child interpret that?
Right.
And how do they model that behavior? So if I recognize that there's something that I'm doing or some experience that I'm having in my
Right.
own relationship with my food and body, I can start to amend that and to shift that and do my own internal work around that, or
Yeah.
at least change what I'm modeling for my child.
Mm,
I can at least change the language that I use around food
right.
in my body so that foods are not illegal or legal. Food is just food, and our
Right.
bodies are our bodies, and there's
Right.
no negative talk about those things. So I
Wow.
think that being introspective and being willing to look at our own relationship with
Right.
food and then changing our behavior in a language so that
Yeah.
it's much more neutral and compassionate.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Like, I guess what I'm hearing is also some tips that you're giving is, take note of the language that you use. There's nothing that's black and white. Like, there's no like good food and evil food. Food is just food, and it's about how much you take it in moderation, and you're having a healthy respect for that kind of language in the house. And the second thing that you mentioned was behavior, like being aware of how our children model us. And it's amazing because we both have toddlers, and
Yeah.
it's just crazy what they pick up. It's like it's so cute, but sometimes it makes you go like, oh wow.
Yeah, that's so
Like
true.
my little 2-year-old, she went around walking around the house with her hands on her back, and I was like, where did she walk like that? And my husband was like, you walk like that all the time at home.
It's so true, though. I mean, when we are raising our children, that's how they learn to engage with the world and how we view ourselves and talk about ourselves, how we experience and talk about food. That's what they learn. And so
Yes, so
they
true.
internalize that to be the truth and the way that they should do things as well. So we have to
Absolutely.
model a
Yes.
different way of being. Even if we, as parents continue to struggle with our own body image and relationship with food,
Yeah.
when we're in the presence of our child, we can show up in a way that's much more supportive and helpful.
Yeah.
So that we're using more neutral language.
Absolutely. I even remember one of the parents who was there at the support group. She was even asking me. She said it was an indirect question, but she was saying how she noticed that her daughters were starting to imitate some of her own eating disorder patterns, and she was feeling really guilty about that. And I remember that I told her that the most courageous thing that she's ever done is to get help at the treatment center, because that showed her daughter's courage. It showed her vulnerability. It showed her willingness to step out of her comfort zone. So I think even for parents who are not perfect, who are, obsessed with exercise or food or image, that it's also a learning journey for us, that, at any point we can say that, I want to change and I want to do my best for my children. And that's a huge motivating factor.
Yes. Yes, and I think, something that parents often say is that they want their children to have
Yeah,
better than they had, or they
of
want to do
course.
a better job parenting
Yeah,
and not make the same mistakes that their parents made.
absolutely.
And there's
Absolutely.
something that we refer to as legacy burdens where, sometimes generationally different patterns are
Right.
passed down. And so when we
Wow.
start to become aware of the patterns that we're actually still carrying out from
Right.
our family of origin,
Yes.
and gain some understanding about how to do things differently, we can
Right.
have a different experience in our own families.
Wow.
But sometimes parents miss how they're continuing to parent in the way that their parents parented them. That
Right.
didn't work. And so now it's no longer working with their children. And so that's continuing to be passed down generationally.
Wow. 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 That is powerful. Thank you. Thank you. Amanda, even as you were sharing tips about how we can change our language and behaviors at home, I was wondering, are there tips and advice with regards to interactions between parents and children? Because those things that you mentioned, they're still external or behavior focused. But what are some of the innate kinds of mindsets or attitudes or the kinds of interactions we can have with our children that help to build a positive environment?
Yeah, I think showing up consistently,
Hmm.
and being really consistent in how we parent, so
Right.
that our child learns that we're going to be there no matter what, not just
Right.
sometimes or when it's convenient, but that we
Mhm.
consistently show up and make love and connection and support available. So
Right.
even when there's a child that's pushing back or not accepting of that, they know that consistently we're going to be there. I think can be really
Mm.
powerful and helpful. I
Wow.
think that also making sure that the child understands that they're not alone, and should they need or want to open up or be vulnerable or share more about what's going on, that the parent can listen without
Mm.
trying to fix and in a non-judgmental way. They can just be
Wow.
there and listen without
Wow.
doing or necessarily even saying anything. But I think
Wow.
that showing up consistently and letting a child know that you're really there and present and available to them can be really powerful and healing.
Wow. Wow. So it sounds to me like some of the attachment problems that could have caused the eating disorder is when a parent is not there for the child.
Yes, or not there in a way that's consistent, or they
Right.
show up but they bring with them all of their own emotional baggage, and so they're really not
Right.
fully
Right.
present, showing up with their own anxieties and agendas.
I hear
They
you.
can show up in a way that's really meant to be supportive of the child and not
Right.
needing to fix it, and being very consistent in how they provide
Right.
support. That can be very healing.
And it sounds like the healing can take place both ways if it's done correctly, because then the child needs to heal in terms of forgiving his or her parents, in terms of letting go, because sometimes parents don't change,
Yeah.
right? They can't, or they don't, or maybe they have their own mental illness that they're battling. And I think for parents, what I'm hearing from you is to take hope, knowing that you can make a difference. And it's not too late to change. It's not, I don't think a child will ever complain if you suddenly decided to be consistent in showing up and being there and being non-judgmental. I don't think anyone will complain.
Right. I think that
Right?
sometimes, someone might say that it's really confusing, or that they're trying to adapt to that change, because if a parent suddenly becomes very consistent and is showing up, that feels really different and can
True.
sometimes be uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar, but it is what they need and what they want. So with time, they can learn to adapt, and they will start to respond in a healthier way.
Wow, that is wonderful. And what would you say to people who have parents that can't change?
I think they have to understand that sometimes we have to come to a place of radical acceptance and accepting our loved ones for who and how they are,
Right.
and acknowledging the needs that we need to have met. So if it's for love or connection or affirmation, and if our parent isn't able to meet that need, and sometimes they're not, how else can we get those needs met internally and in relationships with people who are safe and supportive? And so sometimes it's about learning how to get our needs met in a different way, and just acknowledging and accepting that our parents are who they are and the way that they are. And it's not really our job to change them. It's our job to make sure our needs are getting met, either from that relationship or internally or in some other healthy relationship.
Wow, that is really powerful. That is a gem to keep for sure. Especially for people who are still struggling because their parents won't change. Because we can't change others, but we can change how we feel about them. Isn't
Yes,
it?
we can change how we respond.
Wow.
And I
Wow.
think that sometimes that's a grieving process that people have to
Yes.
go through.
Yes.
Sometimes we refer to that as giving up the wish of having the parents that we didn't, the parents that we wanted but didn't have.
It's so true.
Sometimes we have to grieve that. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is powerful. That is powerful. And I guess one other thing that comes to my mind as you share is, how do we approach healing in a way is that is beautiful? In a sense, sometimes when we approach healing, it can feel prickly. It can feel difficult, challenging. I don't know if you've had experiences where you bring the family together and it's like there's ice in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you break that? How do you overcome that initial resistance? Because I think one of the hardest things is getting past that ice. It's the initial stages. The later parts I find are easier because then you've already broken the ice, and both sides know that you can trust each other. Both sides are committed. But it's that first step sometimes that parents struggle with. They're like, I don't know how to get through to her. I can't even convince her to go for therapy. What would be your advice for parents who are at that stage where something is really wrong and he or she won't talk to me, and I know something is wrong, but I don't know what to do?
Yeah, I think it depends on the age of the child. I think if it's a child or adolescent, you as a parent are able to consent to that individual receiving treatment. So you
Right.
take him or her to see a therapist. If they're not willing to open up and talk to you, you can provide them with an experience of speaking with a professional who's bound to confidentiality. So there's a safe space that they can connect and talk to someone with who's more neutral. And hopefully with time, they'd be willing to open up to you as well, or allow you to be involved in family therapy. But I think creating a space where they can get their needs met until they're willing to open up to you can be helpful. I think if it's an adult child, that can be very hard, because you no longer have as much power in that relationship.
True.
And so I think, again, it goes back to showing up consistently and letting them know that you're there when they're ready. And then, as you discussed in the prior podcast, getting your own help and support. So trying to ensure that you have a network of support and someone to talk to walk alongside you as you're trying to support a loved one with these sorts of mental health issues.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you. Those are really, really useful tips and advice. Yeah. I think maybe one of my last questions would be, because a lot of our listeners, I mean, I'm conscious that for these two podcasts, there are listeners who are from different faiths and different spirituality backgrounds. But what would be your advice with regards to, parents who have grown up in a faith-based culture and they feel that the only way their child can recover is through God, but the child has completely rejected any kind of spirituality, maybe because of some hurts or experiences they've gone through? What would be your advice? Because I think parents often carry a kind of baggage that if my child doesn't believe in what I believe in, especially spiritually, it can be very hurtful to the parent themselves. And yet I find that, the more they push, the worse it becomes.
Yes.
Because they keep thinking that if my child is spiritual enough, he's gonna get past this, but he won't listen to God, and this is whatever.
Yeah.
How
I
do
think
we
the more
approach?
that I think the more that we push that,
Yeah,
sometimes the harder they're going to fight back. I mean, this is sometimes how the psyche works,
yeah,
especially in
it's true.
relationship with children and parents,
Yeah,
especially too in a relationship with an eating disorder. A lot of
right.
times the disorder exists to elicit a sense of power or control. And so the more you push or
Mm,
try to be in control or have power,
wow,
the more the eating
wow,
disorder will manifest. And so
wow,
sometimes we have to give them space to come to conclusions on their own. We need to be there
wow,
and we need to
wow,
provide support and accountability, but pushing
wow.
in certain directions is sometimes going to lend to the opposite
Right.
effect.
And I think this is what you mentioned about showing up, isn't it? That
Yeah.
showing up and showing love, being patient, that speaks so much louder than the words that you say,
Yes, I
right?
think so. And I think,
Yeah.
for the patients that we see in higher levels of care at McCallum Place, you and I have spoken about this, but sometimes
Yeah.
when they come in, if they are really in the depths of despair, depression, anxiety, hopelessness, their eating disorder, they seem like kind of a shell of a person. And
Yeah.
so they just have this darkness to them,
Yes.
and
Yes.
you don't see their personality or, the light
True.
shining through.
True.
And so a lot of therapy is needed to help them
Mm,
to understand the impact of their disorder,
right.
to find sources of hope and motivation, to
Right.
get them nourished and ensuring that their medical and nutritional needs are being met. So
Right.
that basic hierarchy of needs has
Right.
to be addressed. They have to
Mm,
have safety and
mm,
nourishment and,
mm,
you know, adequate sleep hygiene. All of these things have to be addressed before they
right.
can self-actualize and really be connected to their higher purpose and
Understand.
fully connect to
Wow.
God or their
Right,
spirituality.
right. What I'm hearing from you is really profound, because I think sometimes we try to push spirituality on them. And what
Mhm.
you're saying is that they need to be supported ground up to reach that place. And what I'm learning is that meet them where they are at,
Yes.
which means like if they're not comfortable with you, banging, the Bible or whatever at them at this point, then there's really no point. But rather, if maybe a loving note under their door in the morning might be what they need. It might be just, I love you, or a quote of the day from somewhere. It doesn't have to be a verse, but it can be, those are all wonderful ways to connect with your child and meet them where they're at. Yeah,
Yes.
those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you have
Yeah.
to, because the eating disorder or the mental health issue, as we talked about too in the last
Mm.
podcast, we can become very egocentric. And
Yes, yes.
when we are struggling to survive and we're in survival mode, it's really hard for us to focus on anything outside of ourselves because we're
So true.
really just trying to survive. And
So
so
true.
once those survival needs become met and we are getting to a place where we can start to thrive again,
Right,
able to connect with people and things outside of ourselves.
right,
So
right.
I agree. I think showing up and meeting them where they are and giving them the time and space to
Grow.
get there, to grow,
To get
yes.
there.
Providing the consistent encouragement and support
Wow.
is sometimes the best that we
Wow.
can do.
And does this also relate to food fights? Because um, the theme that you brought up was really power and control. And I know that even as I recovered, there was a huge theme of, surrendering and releasing power and control. And I'm just wondering whether this relates to food fights on the table, because so often parents want to kind of force their children to eat, thinking that that's going to solve the problem. And what is your take on that? How can parents, how can we have a good dinner without anyone exploding?
That's a really tough question. So I have different perspectives. I think it depends on the individual, on the person who's struggling, because we do often recommend what's called FBT, or family-based therapy, which is really around the premise that a parent inherently knows how to feed and nourish their child. And so they can be held responsible for ensuring that their child's nutritional needs are met, and they can work with a team of professionals who will monitor weight and help to ensure that they are getting as many calories in each of their meals and snacks to ensure that they're restoring weight at an appropriate rate.
Right.
And so FBT is really focused around empowering the parents to nourish and feed their child.
Right.
But that's not always a mode of treatment that's easy. And sometimes it's contraindicated because it can lend to additional fighting around food.
Right, yeah.
So for some families that really works, and it allows the child to trust that the parents are going to show up for them and to meet their needs. And that's all that the child sometimes needs, is for parents to show up, prepare the food, coach them through eating the food, and that will help to get their nutritional and medical needs met. But for a lot of children, and certainly adult children, being really instructional around the food or trying to force food,
right,
making comments about food, can just feel really shaming.
Yes, I agree.
And sometimes makes the eating disorder voice louder.
So
go ahead.
So what are some tips that you would give, like practical tips that parents can implement at the dinner table? Say I'm a parent who has never been for any of these family therapies, and I just can't get my child to eat with me. Like they'll explode and walk out, or just not show up at all. How do I change that?
That's really hard. I think that parenting 101, we have to be really consistent and how we parent and how we approach food. And so if we have a loved one with an eating disorder, we want to consistently offer food, and we want to consistently provide support around meal and snack times. Right. And so encouraging them to come to the table, and sometimes modeling appropriate behavior.
Right.
We're eating with them.
Yes.
And encouraging them and distracting them through that process. Like, we're going to talk about something else other than food.
Right.
Just to encourage them to be with you, to connect with you as a parent,
right,
and to get their nutritional needs met. Can sometimes be really helpful.
I love what you're sharing right now, because especially in the way I grew up in an Asian culture, like food around the table was really a way for relationships to form. It's such a bonding activity, and I think when the connection is lost, that's when all these food struggles and food fights can happen. And as you were speaking, I realized that one thing that really helped in my recovery was when my loved ones and my parents provided a safe place where there was no judgment, where we could just come together and have a meal without any drama, without any kind of difficult conversations. And I think when that, as you mentioned, just showing up consistently, providing that safe space is really helpful. And when the parents themselves are involved, I remember when my parents got involved, the insight that they received and implemented was so helpful. Because I remember even a time where, and this gets really personal, but I hope it will be helpful, that I remember someone made a comment at the dinner table, and that was so triggering for me at that point, because I was in the thick of recovery. And my response was to leave the table. And I remember, because they had been involved in my therapy, it helped them to reflect. And it never happened again, because they realized that, oh yeah, this is what the therapist told us. That's what's happening now. And it never happened again. But there was such a breakthrough, I think, just knowing that your loved ones are trying. that your parents are trying, there was such a breakthrough, and for them to also realize that I was trying my best as well, and that nobody wanted this to happen, and everybody wanted the situation to get better. So it became two opposite sides being on the same team now, and that was a huge breakthrough.
And I think all parties want the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, I think that if we understand that eating disorders or disordered eating is not really about food or the body, the vast majority of the time it's about more deeply rooted issues. And if we can start to become curious as parents and ask, you know, what's going on? How are you doing? What's causing you to not want to eat? What's triggering this for you? And we peel back those layers. Sometimes we come to an understanding. Oh, you're wanting to avoid this meal because you don't want to ingest the calories, because you don't want to gain weight, because you're fearful of rejection. Well, I'm here to accept you, no matter what your body size, and I want to support you in finishing this meal, so you're meeting their need, and that you're providing that acceptance and support and giving them permission to eat the food. And so when we ask questions and we're curious and we offer support rather than shaming and blaming and saying just eat the food, I think that it can be much safer and loving and supportive.
Wow. It sounds like what you're emphasizing is the heart connection over the words that we say, the instructional words.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, in the previous episode, one of our listeners was writing in to say, you know, how do we stop these binges or cravings? And the background to this was that this particular listener also shared with me that she has a very appearance-oriented family as well, because she's a performer. She performs on stage, and there's a lot of pressure. And so in her situation where her parents, and they live abroad, they live overseas, you know, in a situation where their parents cannot be involved in her therapy, how can she approach them? I remember some of the things that you mentioned was acceptance, you know, realizing that they cannot change. But around times of, you know, great stress, like around the table, like when they actually do meet, because, you know, when you live overseas, you meet up over like Christmas or New Year's, and those are stressful times. How do you meet without exploding? How do you meet being prepared?
Yeah. So I think that it's important to understand what your needs are and what your triggers are, and learn how to set boundaries, so that if your family is doing or saying something that's triggering to you, setting a boundary and let them know how it affects you. So using I statements. I feel really discouraged or hurt when I hear people body shaming or making comments about food at the table. And what I need is for people to use more neutral language, or to not make comments about the food that I'm eating, and to understand this is a part of my recovery. And that will allow me to feel like I'm in a safe environment with you. You know, that's a language that we have to cultivate, and a skill that we have to learn, how to set boundaries and speak our needs to others. And if they're not able to meet those needs, if they're not able to respect the boundaries, what is the consequence going to be? So just like a parent, when we have boundaries that we set with our children, you know, I'll often tell my daughter, okay, if you throw that item again, you will sit in timeout for 3 minutes. So she knows what the consequences of that behavior are. We have to do the same thing in relationships with our parents and other loved ones. So if this behavior continues, does that mean that we don't have meals together? Does that mean that I need to distance myself? Does that mean that I'm going to leave the room and on my own? You know, what am I going to do to ensure that I am safe and protected and taking care of myself?
Right. And I would say that this may only be possible if the other party is, you know, in a way open. Because if someone is if the parent themselves are unstable or unwell, then this might not be approached. And then the other option would then be to work on ourselves to control what we can change, which is, you know, our mindsets, our attitudes, and sometimes just telling ourselves that we can't change them, but we can change the way we prepare our mindsets and our attitudes, knowing that we're going to go into a difficult situation, and this is what I'm going to expect, and this is how I'm going to guard this is how I'm going to guard my heart and my mind. so that when it happens, I can ask myself some good questions like, what happened was really hurtful, but do I really need their approval? And those are really difficult. And then I think getting the support that you need as a person would be very, very important, like seeking help.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is important that we ask for what we need in a relationship, and that we're willing to set boundaries, even if they're not going to be respected by the other individual. I think that it's a language that we start to cultivate within ourselves, that we are empowered to acknowledge how someone else impacts us, speak the needs that we have, and set a boundary around their behavior. And if that's going to be risky or potentially make the situation worse, I agree that sometimes we have to practice radical acceptance and understand that this is something that's likely to occur, and how can I protect my recovery and self-preservation, maintain self-preservation in that relationship when those things arise.
Wow. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you. I like the time passed so fast with you. I realized that it's almost an hour, but it just passed by like a flash.
I could talk about these things for days. So I'm enjoying the conversation.
But I learned so much from you, and I know that this episode is going to be such an important and powerful resource for many, many parents and loved ones, even as they watch them. And if you're listening or watching to this episode, I just want to let you know that there is hope at the end of the tunnel. And as what Amanda said, there are lots of ways for you to get involved in your child's or your loved one's therapy. There are lots of support groups and information that's available, whether it's online or even in country if you Google and look around. But I think some of the key pointers that we can take away today are learning to use our hearts to connect over using instructional words, and also being ready to love and be patient, because that really is going to be the key factor in your loved one's recovery. Amanda, do you have anything else to add? Any last words before we can?
That was really well said. Thank you for allowing me to join the podcast today and to speak about these things.
No, thank you so much, Amanda, for your time and your effort, and most of all, I think your heart. Thank you so much for being with us. It was such a joy and privilege to have you.
Thanks, Waigia.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for tuning in. If any of you have further questions from this episode, please feel free to write in to hello@kitesong.com, and we'd love to hear some of your comments or questions or even testimonies. Thank you so much for journeying with us. I hope that this has been helpful for you. Have a wonderful week ahead.